My name is Norm Bolsky, your host, and this is the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast.
Thanks, Norm. It's an honor to be here, and it's been fun to work with you over the years.
Hello, and welcome to the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast with your host, Norm Bolsky. And today we are thrilled to be joined by Tanya Little, Chief Commercial Officer at Vitality. Tanya, welcome to the podcast.
Super excited to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. So for all of our listeners and viewers that aren't familiar with Tanya's background, Tanya Little, CCO over at Vitality. Tanya is a seasoned health economist, growth executive, speaker, and coach with over 20 years experience in business development, strategy, and leadership. As the chief commercial officer at Vitality, she drives the company's expansion by developing new business lines, shaping sales and marketing strategies, and overseeing go-to-market initiatives. In addition to her executive role, Tanya serves as the external face of the organization, regularly speaking at prominent market conferences and engaging with top influencers. Her expertise spans communication, behavioral science, organizational development, using deep questioning and looping techniques to foster understanding and accelerate revenue growth. Little bit of information about Vitality. Vitality is the largest behavioral health engagement platform in the world that blends industry-leading smart tech, data, incentives, and behavioral science to inspire healthy changes in both individuals and organizations as a whole. Before joining Vitality, Tanya held strategic leadership positions at McKinsey & Company, Accenture, Investec, and was group operations executive at Life Healthcare. Tanya holds a master's in science from the London School of Economics and a degree from the University of Cape Town. So Tanya, welcome, and can't wait to learn about you and a little bit more about what you've been doing these past couple decades.
Thanks, Norm. Super excited for the conversation.
So Tanya, walk us through, what brought you into the healthcare space.
Right. So the move from banking into healthcare, it's like a significant shift.
Yes.
I'd say a combo of push and pull drove the move. The push was probably a nagging concern around purpose. Like, I loved everything about my time in banking. I loved the learning because I had many diverse roles. I loved the people, the culture, the clients. But the truth is, every time I lifted my head, I remembered that if I did my job really, really well, I was going to help a rich someone get a little bit richer. So the prospect of using my days to make people healthier then felt exciting and like something I wanted to do. So that was the push. The pull was actually a call from a longtime mentor. He was the first partner I worked with at McKinsey. Very talented human, cares deeply, has taught me a fortune. And at the time, he was transitioning from McKinsey into the group CEO role at Life Healthcare. And so Life Healthcare is an international healthcare org, like you said. It operates 66 hospitals and outpatient clinics and medical imaging across Europe. So he said to me, come and be my CHRO. Because like you're a little bit young and you're not like a little bit green, you're not really ready for a group exec role, but you could be the CHRO based on your history. And I was like, no, thank you. I'm happy. And he said, okay, come and look after people and our global post-merger integration work and brand. And I said, no, thank you. I'm happy. And then he said, all right, come and launch a primary care business from the ground up and turn around a health solutions business. And I literally gave my notice that day.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good lesson. If you don't love what is being offered, just say no. The offer might get better.
And avoid letting ego get in the way of that decision.
Yep. I think that's great advice. Walk us through your experience as the group operations executive at Life Healthcare and really developing that primary care business.
That was the wildest ride of my career to date, that time period. First time reporting into the group CEO of such a large company. It's 20,000 staff. It's $1.5 billion annual revenue. It's like a big thing. First time interfacing directly with the board of directors. The organizational culture was like totally different from anywhere I'd worked before, much more command and control. And this was my first foray into healthcare. So, like I said, a wild ride.
A lot of things that created a steep learning curve. And just out of curiosity, which countries does Life Healthcare operate in?
So the headquarters is in South Africa, and that's where the hospitals and the clinics are. But in terms of Europe, it's the UK, Poland, Italy, Germany. I'm forgetting a million. Well, I'm forgetting four to be
Yeah.
precise. And then
Any
there was
others in Africa?
no, so it was just South Africa, and then in Europe.
Gotcha. Understood.
But what's interesting is as I was joining, they had just made this acquisition of the medical imaging, and so it was kind of these, and even that entity in and of itself was not well integrated.
Hmm.
So a lot of work to do there. And if I think about the biggest learning or the biggest growth, ironically, it was not gaining familiarity with a new industry or even the new functions or even the new content. Obviously, there was a ton of learning there,
Hmm.
but the true growth was finally I learned how to trust myself. And when I say this, I mean specifically, I realized, oh, I can make mistakes because I made quite a lot of them. Can make
Hmm.
mistakes, and I'm not going to fall apart. I'm not going to disintegrate. I realized I did have the resilience to get back up and try again, even if I had felt, I was wrong. I felt shame. I felt less than. I felt imposter syndrome, all the stuff.
Hmm.
And I realized I also could build relationships to figure out the answers no matter how complex the problem. So, if you say to me, like, what was the experience like? And we can kind of talk more about the primary care business
Hmm.
and other pieces, but that was the biggest learning. And I'm very grateful
What
for
was
that.
the biggest success or handful of successes that you had in that, just success story?
Life healthcare, it had grown up as an acute hospital business. So, core
Hmm.
competencies, clinical operations and care, nursing management, price negotiations. Like the revenue model was all predicated on bodies and beds. And
Hmm.
so, when the group CEO and we wanted to have this exec team embrace a future world that would strive to offer in home care, a focus on prevention, really keeping people out of hospitals for everything other than procedures that need hospitals. And that
Yep.
was so hard at a
Hmm.
cultural level, at a structural level, at an operational level. So if you said to me, what was the greatest success? It's definitely the fact that the primary care business launched.
Yep.
It was really hard. It was fascinating. Designed a new operating model, built the team from scratch, delivered two handfuls of clinics initially in partnership with a scale retail partner,
Hmm.
which was super fun and exciting. I realized how brutal the commercials are. And I think, we've seen that in the US. We've seen several players are shutting down, rationalizing primary care offerings. It's hard to make the money work. But I
Yeah.
also saw how much health consumers valued the convenient, digitally enabled care. I mean, it was truly extraordinary. So I think their responses to the care experience were incredible. So I would like that was a big success. Another success was turning around that health services business. So it was offering employer risk management solutions
Hmm.
through on-site OC health clinics, employee wellness and coaching.
Hmm.
And that was about streamlining the org structure, rationalizing the business portfolio, like refocusing sales strategy and truly transforming culture.
Yeah.
And we improved the operating profit by 20% by the time I
Wow.
was leaving and margin by 15%. And it was amazing for me. That was a different game of like, okay, you have a big business, a big machine. If you can just make tweaks, that didn't need an overhaul, it needed tweaks, and yet there were really significant results.
Yeah.
So I think those were probably the biggest successes. Success also comes from hardship,
Of course.
you know. And I think the two things I would highlight for you there, which I would not say, gee, I was so successful and amazing and wonderful. I would say, wow, this shook my world, and yet we came through it.
Yeah.
One was obviously COVID, but I was this group exec as COVID hit, operating hospitals.
Yeah.
We didn't have certainty. We didn't have answers. We didn't know what we were doing. We were responsible for our employees, but for our patients,
Hmm.
millions of patients. And I think what was interesting is how quickly we could make decisions that would never have been made in a million years because it was a true health crisis. So that was, I guess, successful in the sense that, eventually you take action. The darkest time was May 2020. So not even when COVID hit, but during COVID,
Yeah.
we were hit by a cyber crisis. And I had
Oh.
never been close to that before. I was like, that is a thing that happens, and other people need to deal with that, and it must be hard. It was harder than I could ever have imagined. Um, I was struck by how little humanity there was in
Hmm.
how the criminals were operating. Like they didn't care. They were like, we have images of your patients, and we will use them. We have PHI. It was like a really scary time the flip side was seeing how the exec team came together, and I was amazed at how there was courage in doing the right thing. So the North Star was always like, what is best for our patients? And then that was the compass. So I would say there's a little bit of a mixed bag there, but those would probably be the call outs.
How much of the care was virtual and how much was in person at home?
Nearly 95% of it was in person.
Oh,
Yeah. And that was also part of the shift, right? For this business to be able to say, oh, hey, we actually need to get digital. And that's why the primary care business is what was the first digital foray.
yeah.
And there was some in-home technology that we were using, which was then increasing just before I was leaving, actually.
I'm embarrassed to ask, but what is the like healthcare system like in South Africa as well as some of those European countries? Is it private healthcare? Is it government sponsored? Is it hybrid somewhere in between? Just
No,
want to get an idea of like what that environment was like because then
yes.
I'll ask like, hey, I know Vitality does a lot of business in the US and
Yes.
we'll get to that, but I want to understand what the markets you are familiar with were like.
Yes. And no need to be embarrassed. I'm embarrassed at how little I knew about U.S. healthcare before arriving in this country.
I live here and I also participate in the healthcare system. I still have a very hard time navigating it, even though I spend, I don't know, 70 hours a week, talking and thinking and reading and, listening about healthcare. So it's a confusing market, even for those that spend their whole day in it.
And isn't that the point? Isn't that the craziness of the system? I mean, I'm blown away by that every day. By the way, I'm like, oh wow, didn't know that. I didn't know those prices are made up. Essentially, that is
Yeah.
confusing. So just to answer your question, so I'd see some similarities and some differences between predominantly South Africa and to a degree the UK, but South Africa and the
Mhm.
US. In both, there is a dual system. So both countries have, public and private sectors. In both countries, the private healthcare is incredible. Advanced
What's
medical tech.
percentage, like of the population, how many are on private and how many are on public? Just ballpark percentages.
Ballpark, 10%, 15% are on private if you're looking in South Africa. And that is exactly the point, is really, it is truly a dual system.
Hmm.
Um, an insanely skewed system. And so what you will find in South Africa is there is a portion of the population, I was privileged to be part of that population, that is receiving truly best in class care. That can parallel what you see in other advanced
Hmm.
economies, and in some degrees with less in terms of wait time, etc. And then there is this vast proportion of the population that is, trying to access public healthcare. There are lines out the door. People are often in particular hospitals that people don't have beds. They're literally on the side of the corridor. So there's this really weird bifurcation. Both
And
countries.
the company was focused on addressing which population, if not both.
So it's really interesting. It was private healthcare,
Okay.
so catering to people who were insured and could pay. However, it was one of the few healthcare systems that played a really significant public healthcare role.
Okay.
And so I was really actually quite proud of that. Is that they were doing a lot of pro bono work, didn't turn any patients away, and that was pretty impressive.
I love that. That's great.
I also did. It was like a really cool. There were kind of three primary health systems, and yeah, this was the one that I felt was doing most of the really good work there. In terms of the US and South Africa as well, both countries suffer from a shortage of healthcare professionals. This is not news to you.
That's
High,
every country, I think. I don't know if there's any exceptions, but there's not many.
I don't see them. I agree with you, and certainly in our UK business as well, we just see that exacerbating like over year on year. High and complex disease burdens, again, and to your point, like again, everywhere. And then I would say health disparities. So we've touched on a little bit of this from a South Africa perspective. Marginalized communities, just really, really awful health outcomes. But I see that in the States too. I
Oh
see
yeah.
that there are populations that just limited access to quality care, really poor outcomes. The difference I would probably say in the US that has been most striking is the complexity and the cost.
Yeah.
Really, just trying to bend my mind around that is kind of 4 years in. I'm still not too
Yeah. It's frustrating,
super
as
frustrating.
a consumer as someone who works in the industry, as someone who invests in businesses that like sell into these entities, it's a very complex system. And, the people that know it obviously, can in some ways profit off of it,
Right.
but it's a very sobering reality, in this country. So,
Totally.
hoping there's a brighter future. What inspired you to join Vitality?
So you mentioned I have this MSc from London School of Economics. I'm a behavioral economist.
Mm-hmm.
Vitality was the first place I've worked ever where people actually cared. Like that
You
actually
were an
meant something
economist.
to them. Yes, they were like, "Oh, a behavioral economist. We do that here." Was the narrative. We really do that here.
Yeah.
And that is truly at its roots. It is grounded in actuarial science and behavioral science, and that mattered to me at a personal level. But
Mhm.
many other things about the company inspired me. So, the mission is making people healthier.
Yeah.
That is the mission. um it's global scale and ambition, and obviously, being someone from a different country with a funny accent, it was really important to me that there was an appreciation of global and what it means to be a global citizen, and the fact that there are nuances across countries, and they matter. The
There's a
fact that
lot of funny accents inside the US.
that
I've
is
got
true.
friends up in the Northeast that sound very different than my friends down in the Southeast.
That
And
is
then,
100% right.
there's some funny accents up in the Great Lakes Midwest area. So, I wouldn't necessarily say, every American sounds the same either. So
That is no, that is 100% right. I had a complex about it when I arrived, right? Because I was like, I sound like I'm not from here.
that's
Then
okay.
to your
It's
point, I
probably
realized.
preferred by a lot of people.
Well, they've done some, by the way, a side note, some really interesting, Harvard did some very interesting research into accents, and they found that accents, from a US perspective, accents are, if you encounter someone with an accent, you deem them immediately to be less competent across a range
Oh,
of fronts.
I think higher intelligence.
However, well, there's one accent that trumps all the others, including the American accent, and that is the
British?
British accent.
Yeah, I would agree. It's funny. I can think of one company like off the top of my head that I knew did this. And then I'm sure there are plenty of others, that do this as well. But Big Health. I remember
Yes,
getting like the Sleepio app like very early
that's right.
because I knew like an executive at the company years ago. And since we were representing them at the time, they wanted me to like use the product and try it so I could explain it to potential candidates. And I'm
Nice.
like, like, why do you use a English accent even though like all your, or most of your members are American? They're like, oh, they're more likely to take advice. Like that's backed by science.
True.
And I was like, oh,
True
that's
story. It's
yeah,
insane. So, by the way, some people think I'm British. I'm like, I'm rolling with that,
yeah.
even though I'm not. But so, that is one of the things. Like Vitaly just, was appreciative of different cultures, different perspectives, etc. I think this probably sounds fluffy, but I've listened to many of your podcasts. I really appreciate
Oh, thank you.
the stories that you are bringing. I'm appreciating the insight that your speakers and you bring to the conversation. I've heard you talk a lot about culture, so I was like, okay, it may sound fluffy to some, but to you it won't.
Mhm.
The culture was one of the most magnetic elements at
That's awesome.
Vitality.
And you knew of it before you joined. Like
I
you had heard
did.
about it and
You
had
want
some
you want to?
interaction.
Funny enough, how I knew about it is because, and I can tell you the story later, but Vitality was born of a health plan. And the reason I joined the health plan in South Africa was to access Vitality. And so my
Mhm.
experience of Vitality before even joining the company was joining as a member in South
Yeah.
Africa. What I knew to be true about the culture, though, from people who work there, like very people centric, valuing intellectual leadership, not title,
Mhm.
valuing bias for action, not like academic ruminations,
Mhm.
experimentation, not perfection, and then a big thing around liberating the best in people. So I like to think of Vitality as a free market for talent,
Mhm.
because pretty much you will have a job description. Of course, there are core things you must do,
Mhm.
but based on who you are, people will use you in different ways, and they will play you to where you're strong, and it's a beautiful thing. So I joined Vitality remotely during COVID with a time zone gap of 8 hours, a geographical distance between me and my US headquarters of 8,500 miles or something
Mhm.
similar. But I still felt like I was able to bring my whole self right from the beginning. And it felt a little bit like coming home.
I love that.
Yeah.
Walk me through just similarities and differences between the South African healthcare system and the US healthcare system. Like, what were you like, oh, wow, this is like actually very similar? And what are the things that you're like, these things could not be more different?
So I think it is, the similarities are around there's a duality. There is, as we are saying, it's a global thing. Shortage of healthcare professionals. There's this health disparity, and I was surprised about the degree of health disparity in the US. And again, that was just naivety on my part, but I was like, surely most people get really quality care. And that is not the case, that most people get quality care. So I
No.
think, there are a lot of similarities. Like I say,
There's also no correlation between price and quality.
that,
That is
that,
wild to other people that haven't experienced it.
yes. So that is where the differences, I would say, and truly eye popping moments. So charting quality and cost and seeing no correlation, charting cost and outcomes and seeing some of the worst outcomes with some of the highest healthcare costs. For me, a truly wow moment was having the CEO of a reference-based pricing company explain to me how pricing is formulated, saying to me, this is actually an imaginary number that is hitting the consumer. And so we're actually talking in imaginary numbers, and this is how we think about reference-based, relative to MA. And I just could not wrap my head around that. So those kinds of things have blown my mind. What I would say though is, when the care works in this country, wow, does it work? I mean, it's mind blowing. The quality of specialists that one can get,
Mhm.
the way people are really trying to innovate, how competitive it is in healthcare,
Mhm.
the competing interests, and this is all good and bad. It's like if only we could collectively put our heads together and from a systemic lens say
Yeah.
what matters. But truly the innovation, the brain power, the commitment to care, like that has also been striking, in addition to the eye-popping price and outcome data.
Yeah, and I'm very lucky myself because I live in Cleveland, Ohio. The Cleveland Clinic is right in my backyard.
Right,
My mom has been in healthcare her whole career. She was a labor and delivery nurse, then started teaching at Case Western Reserve. Then she became dean of nursing at several different colleges around the country and did that for 15 plus years. And then my dad was a medical malpractice lawyer in the city. So,
wow,
like, also he had a whole different perspective on, hey, like, if you get really quality care, you're going to have great outcomes. If you don't, like, you could have horrible life impacting situations.
yeah,
So, like, I'm in a really unique scenario where I live near one of the top 5 health systems in the world. I come from a healthcare family. Like, my mom, sisters, like dad, grandparents, like, all came from healthcare. And a lot of the doctors at Cleveland Clinic grew up in the same area I did, go to the same social events, go to the same religious functions, all these types of things. So, like, if something happens with a family member, which we've had everything from very minimal things to cancer diagnoses, within my family, we are one call away from a friend who can recommend the best specialist in the city,
right,
thus, one of the best in the country. So, like, we are super informed healthcare consumers. Still not easy to navigate, but like we can find our way, at least in my family. But like
right.
we have every advantage, and like so many people don't have access to that. So I think it's just a very, unfortunate reality is that, a lot of us are very lucky, and like
That's
most
right.
people don't have that same level of opportunity and access and knowledge to really guide yourself to the best care, as opposed to just putting your fate in the hands of a health plan or a big health system whose goal is to either make money or save money.
Right. Maybe both. 100% right. I'm curious to know, just based on the story of your mom in particular,
Mhm.
like if she had one piece of advice for the healthcare system, what would that be after all these
Ugh.
different hats?
She's a strong advocate of leveraging nurses and
Yes.
really leveraging nurse practitioners, letting doctors truly work top of license and really delegate a lot of tasks to very capable nurse practitioners. I know that's like a big um, recommendation she's made, and then she's done all types of different stuff in diversity, equity, inclusion, and building culture and creating new care models. And I could talk about all the things she's done in her
She
career
sounds like a good
for
human.
many episodes. But that would be her general advice. And then like in practice, it's, hey, when you have a big issue health wise, go to the best. Like
Yeah.
she's had friends that had cancer diagnoses, and she was up in Boston running the UMass Boston nursing school for a bunch of years. So she's had some friends who've gotten cancer diagnoses, and she got them in for meetings with like the national experts at Dana Farber. So, it's nice to know that like if you have the right connections, you can get to the best care and like
Yes.
potentially save or improve your life, quality of life, depending on, the care you can get. But like that is the advantage very, very few, like the minority of people have. So, in one case, it's nice to have that access, but in another case, like you almost have some guilt because you're like, hey, I'm getting things that most people don't have the
Right.
ability to get.
Right. Right. And yet you are advocating for change, right? So that's the quid pro quo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Like this market can be better, and there's a lot of companies in small pockets doing it better. And now
Correct.
it's about being able to scale those ideas, that are really, really helping some communities in need.
100%.
So, walk me through, like, as chief commercial officer of Vitality, what your philosophy is on building teams.
Yes. So I probably referenced this when I was, in the free market for talent. I'm alluding to this. My philosophy is grounded in the principle of playing to strengths. Like, I just don't believe we all need to be equally good at everything to be successful. I don't believe it's a solid route to happiness. At McKinsey, the principle was like, you must be good at these 4 dimensions and at these, 4 subdimensions and these categories within. And I found I was spending a lot of time on stuff I was never going to be spectacular at and not feeling that great about honing those skills. So for me, a good leader is able to say, they can identify what makes someone exceptional. They can identify when someone is in flow, and they can put them in a role that leverages their superpower, because that is how people shine. So like, to me, that's step one on building a team. But step two is, all right, bringing those people together. Now they must function as a team,
Mhm.
not as a collection of individuals. So I've seen a lot of, hub and spoke, command and control. Those work. But I think for me, the prevailing mindset should be, how do you get to we, not me?
Mhm.
And high performing teams are the ones that can combine their skills, and then they can serve as kind of force multipliers for the organization. So
Mhm.
for me, if you want a high performing team, you have to create safety. So, people need to feel free, like they can express their views, they can
Mhm.
experiment, they can give feedback, including to the boss, and they can be themselves. So I have spent a lot of time in my career learning how to build an emotional container. I spent a lot of time at the Singularity Institute in Portland. That was all the way back 2014. I was like
Mhm.
super early stage pregnant and like very vomity for most of the time. And then I realized some of that was a pregnancy, but some of that was also, the work was hard. It was like, how do you manage a group? How do you read what's going on beneath the surface? There is stuff that people are saying, but then there's the stuff that's actually going on. And how do you work with that for team dynamics? So I think that is important for me, as like kind of ingredient two, is the emotional safety. And then the third piece is just really, really excellent communication. Sounds trite. It's like communication. It sounds so boring, but actually I'm fascinated by it. I think it is a huge skill set. I think it can be taught and learned. And I think
Mhm.
if we were better at communicating, teams would function a lot better. We can talk more about that later, but that's a big passion point.
Yeah, and I think that will only get more important over time because
I
I think
agree.
each generation, the more technology they have grown up with, the worse they are at communicating one on one. And, the worse, or the more they struggle with handling conflict.
Right.
So, like, I've been a huge advocate because I see it with, like, the candidate pool in which we're recruiting. I see it
Right.
with my own team, which, like, many of the people on my team are, like, one generation like below, like grew up just like with different reality, different values, different access to information and access to technology, and really dependence on technology.
Yes.
um, so I think like that's only going to get more important, and the leaders that really focus on that are going to thrive, and the ones that say, oh, that's not that big of a deal, like they can really struggle. So I think that's a really, really good point. How do you manage culture from halfway across the world?
Well, with difficulty, I am now very happy to be, now I'm in the mix. So I am, by the way, based in Boston. I didn't share this earlier, based in Boston, but
Talk about funny accents.
right? I can't even, I can't even do an impression of the Boston accent because it's embarrassing. I was previously in Chicago, so people, kind of said to me, "Aha, you don't have that accent either."
Yeah, that
So
one's a pretty pronounced one.
it
Like
is.
you go up into like Wisconsin and Minnesota, you get some really thick accents as well.
That's
So yeah,
right.
there's funny pockets within
Which
the
has been
country.
fascinating to me to learn that. Um, but so, how do you build culture? I guess it's easier in person than it is remotely. But so many people are remote. Like virtual is how it is in many instances, and of course, hybrid environments. So when I think about culture, for me, first of all, how do I define it? It's how we do things around here.
Hmm.
Is how I think about culture. And so, by definition, culture is lived. And so when we're talking about culture, we're talking about a way of being rather than what we say we are. It's like is, not should.
Yep.
So if that is the case, when we're talking about culture, I typically think of this in terms of four overlapping or interlocking puzzle pieces.
Hmm.
Tell the story, walk the talk, build capability, and align the system.
Hmm.
So tell the story would be, does everyone understand the why behind how we do things around here?
Hmm.
And this is where the story on behavioral biases, like remember, we all have behavioral biases. They're not good, they're not bad, they are. When you are telling the story, remember someone is interpreting the story through the lens of their behavioral bias.
Hmm.
So when you're telling a story about the culture is like this, but there is loss involved, think about loss aversion. Think about what is going on inside of that person and think about the filter that they are,
Yeah.
processing that story through. So I think that's number one, is really compelling wise. The next is walk the talk. And so I'm always, I laugh endlessly, like, you know, uh we want a culture of like flat structure. There's no hierarchy here. And then, you save yourself the executive parking spot. And so in that moment, there's nothing good or bad. Again, it just is. But what you are sending is a signal to say, actually, this is how we do things around here.
Hmm.
So making sure that those two things match and there isn't dissonance. The third would be capability. Like people do need to understand how to do things the way we do them around here.
Hmm.
So it's about tools. It's about like making sure people feel good about learning, not shamed.
Hmm.
I know you've had many conversations with people on this podcast around
Hmm.
rebranding. Failing is learning. I think that is
Hmm.
helpful. And then the fourth piece around aligning the system, what I'm always interested in is even if people know, what to do and how to do it, they won't do it if you haven't removed friction points and if you haven't aligned the system. So this would be things like, do people get rewarded for behaving in culturally aligned ways? Is it easy for them to behave in
Hmm.
culturally aligned ways? Are they set up organizationally to behave in culturally aligned ways? And I remember consulting to an organization where they were trying to land a digital culture and they were trying to explain, like the doctors, they wanted the doctors to use a patient app.
Hmm.
Couldn't understand why it wasn't happening. And what they realized is that when patients had a problem with the app, for those doctors who had shared the app, they'd call the doctors. So the doctor, because there was no call center, so the doctor was like becoming the troubleshooting guy or gal. And that was just a fundamentally missing, like unsexy but systemic piece. Have a call center so that the doctor's not the one who's on the other end, and you will
Yep.
start to see behavior change. So, I think about those pieces all coming together in terms of building culture.
So you speak regularly at key market conferences. What is three things an individual can do to be, a better public speaker?
Yes. I mean, probably I would start with practice.
Hmm.
Like practice. And when I say practice, I'm like practice out loud, not just in your head. So different synapses and neurons fire when you are rehearsing something or thinking through something in your head versus verbalizing it out loud. So I think the first step is, if you want to be brilliant, don't get complacent, don't get lazy, do the work and do the practice. I think that makes a real difference to the performance, but also your confidence. That's probably number one. Number two would be trust yourself. I've too many times when I was, learning how to speak, I had this weird idea that like the audience knew better than me, or like you are there because you know your content.
Hmm.
So, and the audience doesn't know what you plan to say. They don't know the order you plan to say it in. So like own it and lean into it, and focus on, wowing them with your content and your expertise rather than second guessing the second guesses. Because I find often newer speakers, there's the conversation I'm having with you, then there's the conversation in my mind. Oh, why'd you say that? Oh no, that was the wrong order. Oh no, you forgot point 3. Like, that is an unhelpful dialogue that needs to be quietened down. And then the third is probably the value of structure, which again sounds like it's super unsexy, but it's important. Growing up, I did a lot of debating, public speaking, and the key thing was tell your audience what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Use 3 key points. That way, it doesn't matter, if you are an expert and in the same audience, someone is a novice, I can be really structured at a high level and I can dive into the detail and dive back out, dive into the detail, dive back out. If I lose my spot, I know where I am in my structure. So those are the kinds of things that I would add. I would say I'm going to be noting at a 4th point, even though you said 3, just stories, the power of storytelling, and the human anecdotes, the color. That's what people remember.
Talk to us about looping techniques you use and your team uses to accelerate revenue growth.
Yes. So this is probably from my LinkedIn profile, which is the looping is really just a technique for communication. It's one of the super communication techniques per Charles Duhigg, who he recently released his new book, which I love. All it is, it's the idea that it's a technique to ensure that both parties in a conversation fully understand each other. Mm-hmm. It's very useful in conflict resolution, mediation, deal making, any situation where you need clear and empathetic communication. And essentially how it works is super simple, is, listen actively. So you're listening to what the person is saying, their words, their tone, their body language. Then you are paraphrasing. You are reflecting back what you heard in your own words. So this shows that you're actively trying to understand the perspective and you're checking for accuracy. So you're saying, so what I hear you saying is X, is that correct? And then you're clarifying. So if the speaker says, no, that's not actually what I meant ABC, it's like, okay. And we repeat this process until we're both clear. And the reason that looping for understanding is really important in accelerating revenue growth is when you are working with a client and you want the solution to fit them and you want it to be about them, it's really critical to understand them. And so it's this idea of I'm working to understand you and I want to check I'm getting it. I want to check that in my own words, we're aligned. And that is how, in my experience, you can unlock a lot of deal making.
Love that. As a communication expert, what would you say are the 3 most common communication flaws in leaders within organizations?
We just don't pay enough attention to communication.
Yeah.
We don't do it often enough. We don't do it well enough. I think in some ways, because we all talk every day and like some of us do it for a living, we think, well, we don't need to be that thoughtful in our preparation, or we don't have to be that intentional in our messaging. But I think, to me, and we've discussed this, I think it's the unlocker of culture, it's the unlocker of performance, it's the unlocker of safety. There are several things. Again, this kind of idea of super communication is Charles Duhigg highlights the attributes of super communicators, and he says, anyone can be one. You will know them, by the way. When I describe them, you will know people who are super communicators, but you can also, all of us can be super communicators. So the first is they're focused on questions less than answers, and they're typically asking like 10 to 20 more questions than the average person. Those questions are not just yes, no questions. They're deep questions. They touch on values. They touch on experience. They're open-ended. So true learning questions. The second thing they do is they pay attention to and match the conversation being had. So any of your listeners and you and me, have lives personally and professionally. And often we're having a conversation so stuck, like our partner or our friend or someone on our team is sharing a problem and we're solving the problem for them. Why is this conversation go so wrong? They're getting really angry and I'm getting really angry in retaliation. Why are they ungrateful? Here's the support. And what's often happening is we're not having the same kind of a conversation. So an emotional conversation is actually about our feelings. And a practical conversation is around solving a problem or making a plan. And a social conversation is how do we relate to each other? So a classic instance would be someone saying to you, I felt so bad about myself today. I just had too much work and I didn't get through it. And the natural tendency would be to say, well, how can we prioritize better? Have you thought about the important things, like, etc.? So now I'm in problem solving mode. I'm practical. but that may actually have been an emotional cue to say, I'm so sorry, that must have been hard for you, tell me about it. You can hear the difference, and you can hear how we miss each other in the first instance and not in the second. So I think, if we were thinking more around super communication, I feel like we would be getting further.
If my wife was in the room, she'd be like coughing and like giving me an eye, like, yeah, Norm, you should take notes on that.
It's hard.
I'm such a problem solver that like when someone comes to me, I'm like, okay, like what can I solve for you?
That's right.
Sometimes they just want to talk,
That's
and not
exactly right.
necessarily get advice. So I need to remember that myself. I
Yeah.
know it's one of my many weaknesses. So in addition, what can someone start doing today to be a better communicator professionally?
I just intentionality, truly. I mean, I really recommend thinking about bringing awareness to how you communicate or don't.
Yeah.
So truly, are you thinking about the kinds of conversations? Are you thinking, like, do you ask questions? Even just observing yourself, how much of the time am I talking versus asking questions? What kind of questions do I ask? When I ask them, do I listen? How much recall do I have? Like, these are the things. I'm also a big believer in feedback, and I think you know this well. I've heard you discuss this previously. Is, as you get more senior in an organization, like, people just don't give you feedback,
Hmm.
and you have to actively solicit it, because otherwise you don't get better and you don't know where you're at. And yet there are very helpful ways of asking for feedback, and then less helpful ways of asking for feedback. So I think also, if someone is thinking about becoming a better communicator, ask people how you are showing up. But there are great techniques for how you can ask that in a way that makes people want to share rather than kind of shut down.
This is a selfish question, but I'm going to ask it. Something
Do.
I've been working on, especially because, as you said, like you just continue as you grow in your career to get less and less direct feedback,
Yes.
and especially negative feedback. So, what I've
Yes.
been asking people, you know, in a lot of different capacities, hey, what's your feedback? I way more prioritize negative over positive feedback.
Right.
I'm more interested in hearing what wasn't good as opposed to what was. Um, is that a effective way, and like what might be a more effective way of like having people feel comfortable to give negative feedback? Um, should you be that direct, or should it be a little bit more soft?
Look, I, like you, am really invested in, let's call it constructive. Let's call it developmental feedback, but yes, negative. I'm invested in that. Like you, I've realized. So this is my learning. Some people, you can ask it directly and they will answer. You probably know who those people are, though. They are probably the people who tell you anyway. So,
Yeah.
like, the idea of then saying to someone negative feedback can feel quite well, I'm trapped now. I have to give feedback, and I'm now, the danger is that someone can look for the most watered down or muted version of the negative feedback they could give you, which may not actually be the most important feedback for you to hear.
Mhm.
A technique I have found helpful, and it's linked to what I believe to be true about how we operate. I believe there is no such thing as a strength and a weakness. I actually fundamentally believe that flip sides of the same coin. Let me
Mhm.
give you the example. Uh, I am by nature, Tanya, a perfectionist is sort of too, uh, it's like a broad word, but I am really driven for quality, and
Mhm.
everything must be quality all the time. And that means I set high bars. I'm inspirational. This is what I hear. I'm aspirational. I really am trusted because I get the stuff done. But equally, the flip side of that is I'm impossible. Like, not everything needs to be done to that level of quality. And in fact, in facilitating a team dialogue, all the way back in my banking days, I had a really awesome conversation where the team said, you apply the same level of rigor to the snacks at the strategy session than you do to the actual strategy session and the conversation. And they were like, that is unnecessary and it's unhelpful because it's not the good use of time. And that for me was like, whoa, that is wow. So the reason I'm sharing that as an anecdote is I think that you will often find that you could ask someone for feedback and you could say, what do I do where there is shadow and light? If I overuse it, how does it end up showing up? This skill of mine, or this
Mhm.
attribute of mine, and people will then feel freer to say things like, well, you're a massive extrovert and that really helps when you're winning us business and you're getting into people's heads. But it also means you don't leave us alone. You assume that we're all the same, and actually I do need some quiet time, etc., etc.
Mhm.
So I think that is a useful way of opening it up without it feeling too dangerous for people.
I love that. And like a lot of what you shared, I do that as well. I kind of have a similar makeup. So
Right.
something good for me to think about for sure,
Right.
and improve upon. So you've mentioned a couple times like strengths and weaknesses, and
Yeah.
sometimes like it's a double-edged sword. Like the very thing that makes you successful also makes you sometimes difficult, to
Yes.
partner with, work with, whatever it may look like. Um, when you're recruiting, people for your team, are you trying to find people strong where you're weak? Are you
Mm.
trying to, once you identify where someone's strong and where their weaknesses are you more interested in, hey, if they're strong in areas we're weak, like let's bring them in, regardless of what their weaknesses are? Or is it more important to index on, hey, here are the people's weaknesses, and do we have structure around them that can like help them with those things so that they can focus on what they're actually, really naturally good at?
Yeah, I mean, and so that you are probably. I'm curious to know your view, given you do this. You're just well versed here. My philosophy is as follows: I'm looking primarily for attributes when I'm hiring. I really care about attributes, and those would be things like, first of all, integrity. Hard to know, but there are some pieces where you can get close to kind of figuring that out. I really want to know this human is a good human, is the
Yeah.
first piece. And I want to know, I'm going back to the life healthcare example. I want to know that in a cyber crisis in the middle of COVID, the question they're going to ask is what's best for the patient, not how do I get out of this with the least, like, dark smudges on me. So I think that's number one. Other attributes I would be really interested in. I'm interested in if they're curious. I'm interested in if they have EQ and IQ.
Hmm.
And I'm
If you had to
interested.
pick one, which one would you index more on?
Funny enough, EQ.
I, like,
Is
I think that's not even debatable for like what I've seen over 13 plus years of doing this. I
right.
would argue 90% of venture backed startups tend to index IQ way over EQ, and
There
that
you go.
tends to be a lot of their downfall.
100. And I'll tell you this, like as a management consultant, my frustration was so much was around the IQ. Here is the best possible slide you have ever seen. It is the smartest slide you've ever seen. I'm going to put this slide in front of you, and you're going to what? You're going to do nothing. You're going to read the slide, but there was no engagement around how would this work for you? Like, how would we change the culture? Like, how would, So I'm aligned with that. I do believe that skills can mostly be taught. Like, nothing is really rocket science, and maybe I'm biased because my own career has just been shaped by so many different roles, so many, and ultimately everything is learnable. Where I would caveat my perspective is there are some things where there are gaps where I know I need a particular thing.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the idea of playing to strengths. Like I want someone who has a natural bias for, um, whether it's a decision making, whether it's contextual stuff that they bring. Um, I am like very invested in like, I get really intense and focused in conversations, etc.
Mhm.
And sometimes I need a dispassionate lens to say, actually, if you look at this rationally and if you turn it around in these three ways, this is what it is, and that's super helpful. Um, so I don't know if I'm sort of fudging the answer, but
No,
but
it's
I,
fantastic. Great advice and perspective. Vitality is one of the largest behavioral engagement platforms in the world. Can you walk us through where Vitality was when you joined in 2020 and where it is now?
yes, it's pretty cool the way it has grown. Like I think it's been a story of moving from strength to strength, but
Mhm.
the maybe to say what is the one thing that has stayed the same is there is a magic around this platform, which is that it is unusually good at reaching members. That is the strength of the platform. And like I said to you, it was, Vitali was founded by two actuaries who in retrospect must have been, they were slightly crazy. It was 1992. It was South Africa. They had started up a health plan, and they were noticing that there was a shortage of doctors. There was community rated insurance, and there was a high and complex disease burden. And they realized that if they wanted to make good on their mission of making people healthier, and if they wanted to make the plan commercially viable, they needed to get people to do the things that are good for their health.
Yeah.
That was the start. And it was like the true idea, eat your own dog food. It was like they built it for their own plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, they were using actual and behavioral science to reach members. And from when I joined, from when I knew about it from the beginning, from when I joined it as a member all the way back in the early 2000s, what we know to be true, and in the US we see this, is more than half of our members, 53% of our members in the US, are on average engaging in 12 point earning activities per month. Now, the reason that's important is a point earning activity, any activity has been calibrated by the clever actuaries, not me. The clever actuaries have said this activity is important for someone's health. Actuarially, it's important. So that means people are going in and doing, 3 times a week, something that is important for their health, not just checking in and checking back out again. And the reason that I'm on, in reference to your question, what has changed? This has stayed the same, is that every time we're talking to a client, we're saying, imagine if you could get your employees or your members' eyeballs 3 times a week and get them to care enough and feel enough agency that
Mm-hmm.
they could change their behavior in a way that is good for their health. What could you do with that?
Mm-hmm.
And so that is fundamentally at its core what has happened. Since 2020, certainly we've scaled globally and in the US, but we've also improved sophistication of the product offering. And
Mm-hmm.
where we are going is we started in the US much more narrowly kind of prevention, typical wellness.
Yep.
And where we are going now is moving to the intersection of wellness and care. So
Mm-hmm.
this is the idea of, what if I could offer you truly integrated coaching? What if I'm the coach, you are the member? I can see into your member journey. I can feed
Yeah.
activities into your member journey. Those activities are going to get incentivized. You're going to get nudged and prompted. Behavioral science is powering the whole thing. Next best actions are showing up for you that I can view your assessment results. I can refer you to someone, but it's all one integrated experience. That is where we're going, and we've started along that journey, which I'm super pumped about. The other thing that is coming we've honed this in the group, and now we're bringing it to the US,
Mm-hmm.
is truly hyper personalization. And so
Mm-hmm.
the kinds of things that have been built and used elsewhere, and we're now localizing in the US, is essentially 3 models, which may be interesting to you because this is how they come together and power the platform:
Yep.
value model, the propensity model, and the relevancy model.
Mm-hmm.
Value model is calibrating the actuarial value of a health action. The propensity model is then looking at your willingness to actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we know that? Because we look at what you've done before. The best predictor of what you're going to do next is what you have or haven't done before.
Very true.
So and then we pretend that doesn't exist. We're like, oh, Norm should stop smoking. Let's tell him to stop smoking 4 different ways. Like, he's not going to do it. But what if, so his propensity is low, but what if we could serve him up a recommendation to move more, because we know that is correlated with better behaviors. He's likely to ultimately stop smoking. So that's propensity. And then relevancy says, okay, but Norm has a particular set of health risks and preferences that is different to Tanya. So then again, we're going to re-rank and reorder those recommended actions based on those. So you see those 3 models interplaying together, which is super exciting. We do have a habit index, which is basically saying, if you have a strong or a weak habit, or a good or a bad habit, I have to work less hard to get you to do something.
Yeah.
And so that overlays, but that at right now is only applied to physical activity, not like clinical activities.
Gotcha. Understood. Have you seen any differences in engaging U.S. populations as opposed to, South African or European populations?
It is incredible how Homo sapiens are Homo sapiens. It is remarkable, the consistency. We see similar engagement rates. We see engagement rates in the same activities. We see similar behaviors. Like, we do A/B testing of our
Well, that's a
communication.
ray of hope.
I think it is. It kind of is, and it also is so humbling, right? Because so we serve 40 million members across 41 markets as
Mm-hmm.
Vitality, of which the US is one, South Africa one, the UK is one, across Europe and Asia,
Yep.
etc. And we just 60 million life years of data is what is produced by that, and we are able to use the data from across the world to say, like, broadly, we can predict what this person's going to do, even if they're in a different country. I tell you what I have seen that has really been interesting to me is the way different states operate here
Yeah.
is no more pronounced or less pronounced than how different countries operate. That's how I would frame it up to you. Is like, yes, there are some nuances. For sure, there are nuances.
Mm-hmm.
Globally, also, there's a different way. Like, we know, for example, in terms of motivating people in the Netherlands, Charity is a big deal, really big deal. So you want to dial that up. They care about cycling pedal strokes rather than steps necessarily. These are the kinds of tweaks you can make, but the broad brush, we are biologically the same.
That's great. I think it's really important that us in industry not only, obviously preach this stuff, but also practice it as well.
Right.
So kind of walk me through what you do to, reduce stress, exercise, participate in wellness in
Yes.
a very stressful job.
It is a stressful job, and I think having discussed this previously with you, like I am probably prone to stress. I care too much in some instances
Yeah.
about everything must be perfect, which is ridiculous. Biggest de-stresses are exercise. Like I use it as every single day, and on the days when I don't exercise, I can feel it, and it's really important.
What's your favorite way to exercise?
If I can, I'm outdoors.
Okay.
Anything, running, hiking, swimming, anything that allows me to move my body. I'm happy to be inside if I need to be. When it gets colder and darker, I lift weights for strength. I just learned how to ski. So my husband is like a pro skier, boarder, all the things, but like I just in my 40s learned how to ski with my girls who are 8 and 10.
Yeah.
But so really, if I can just be moving, that helps me. But I do want an endorphin. On the days when I'm most stressed, I want a big endorphin push.
Yep.
And then de-stresses. Yeah, exactly. And then de-stresses also, downtime with my family really matters to me. And then also just truly meals with good friends where I can kind of let it all hang out.
That's great. Very good. And the last question I ask is, especially in the United States, like there is really like very good looking food, but it's horrible for you, like very tempting. There's temptation everywhere you look. Like I think every American probably sees thousands of advertisements a day of like junk food that's like really bad for you. So I think it's really important that people cook at home and, get inspired by what other people are eating. So just out of curiosity, any healthy meals that you make at home that might inspire someone to try something new?
So first of all, just to your point, so aligned. I cook a lot. It's the only way I know what's going into our bodies.
Yeah.
I was, and I will tell you this. I arrived in this country. I put on 10 pounds. Like it was terrifying.
It's a hard thing unless you are really, really disciplined.
You have to be, and even then, I was like, I think I'm eating the same kinds of things.
Paying attention.
That's the point. Like, oh, this has this thing called cornstarch. That's not. I'm not. My body wasn't used to that. So I like to brag that I'm like a whiz with salads. I like to brag that I can, make a salad that an 8-year-old will eat and eat happily. Biggest tip there is actually the more raw food you put into your salads, the better. So I don't know how people make but I put cabbage and corn raw, all of it raw, broccoli, carrots, tomatoes, like it's all going in there and it's amazing and delicious. I like making seared salmon. I like stir fries. I like poke bowls, anything where it's just sort of as natural as I can go. I do confess I like a good pie, but when I'm eating pie, I'm baking my own pie. And then I still know what's in there.
Very, very nice. Well, again, Tanya, thank you for joining us on the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast. Really wonderful episode. Love your enthusiasm and optimism, for the healthcare system, both in the US and across the world. And thank you so much. And we'll be monitoring, what Vitality and you are doing to improve healthcare going forward. So thank you for all you do.
I really appreciate the questions and the curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Please like, comment, and subscribe below if you enjoyed it.